Well, thanks everybody for joining us for this month's edition of African Liberty webinar. My name never changes, still Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, and I am the managing editor here at African Liberty. With me is Professor Ben Radley, who is a political economist and lecturer in international development at the University of Bath. His research centers on the interplay between green transitions and economic transformations in Central Africa, with a focus on labor dynamics and the roles played by northern corporations. He is the author of Disrupted Development in the Congo, the Fragile Foundations of the African Mining Consensus, which is to be published in November 2023, I believe. So, Professor Bradley, it's an immense pleasure to have you, but also to have you because you are an amazing expertise on, you have an amazing expertise on Congo, which seems to be the central point of many discussions that often concern mineral crisis in Africa today. So welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, sir. So from the get-go, and again, you in the audience, you can send your questions anytime. My first concern, I study history, and my first concern has always been, I think I understand the answer, but for many who might not, why are we talking about conflict mineral in 2023 in Africa again as something that affects Africa and the West primarily, just like we talk about it even during the latter days of colonial administration? Why are we seeing that debate come up again?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I answer, I feel like there's some feedback coming from, I'm not sure if it's your colleague, Peter. Does he need to mute his, there we go, that might be better. So why are we talking about conflict minerals in 2023, when it's a conversation that I suppose started back in the 2000s and picked up speed around 2010 originally? I think there are two reasons why, primarily. I think the first reason is that conflict minerals, as it was originally conceived of and approached in Eastern Congo, is still very much an ongoing issue. You still have low intensity conflict taking place across various parts of the Eastern Congo, and there's still an enormous amount of work and attention and focus on trying to address conflict minerals in the Eastern Congo. A second reason why I think this conversation might have picked up more intensity in recent years is related to green transitions, for want of a better word, or is related to, in particular, in Congo, the extraction of cobalt, which has created a lot of attention around the cobalt supply chain, and looking at labor rights abuses, looking at child labor. Of course, the large irony with that is the fact that where cobalt is being produced in southeastern Congo, in the former Katanga region, this region is not a region where there is conflict taking place to the same extent that there is in the Eastern Congo. Although there has been a book published recently called Cobalt Red, which I think sort of has been a little bit confusing in associating it with being a conflict mineral. But the reality is quite different. Nonetheless, I think dynamics around cobalt is another reason why this has got a bit more oxygen recently, and people are starting to focus with more intensity on conflict minerals in light of how much demand there is for cobalt globally at the moment and in the next decade and going forward.
Yeah, cobalt certainly, but more so because Congo is the baby here. And of course, we are acquainted with the story of the King Leopold extraction and chaos in the Congo. Do you think there is any correlation between what happened then and what we're seeing now? Why is it the Congo every time, frankly?
I think there is, I think those colonial legacies definitely still resonate and have strong relevance today. So yeah, I think there is a connection, to the extent that, as you reference, back towards the end of the 19th century, first of all under King Leopold and then under the Belgians, Congo was essentially forcibly integrated into the global economy as a mineral exporter. And you see this when you look into that period in detail. You see the extent to which the finance and investment coming from Belgium at that time was almost exclusively focused on establishing mineral exports and some agricultural commodities and exports, particularly rubber. And so this was the way in which the Belgians, King Leopold, and then the Belgian government integrated the Congo into the global capitalist economy. And that is still primarily the way in which the Congo is integrated into the global capitalist economy today. I was looking at some data recently, and I think it was 96% or 97% of Congolese exports come from 3 commodities: copper, cobalt, and gold, which is pretty shocking and striking when you think of it. So yeah, those legacies are still very much present, are still very much with us. And then, of course, the other side of this with conflict minerals, though, is of course the conflict in the Congo, which has been ongoing since the start of the Congo Wars in the mid 1990s, and that still continues to be with us today. And so those two aspects together, I suppose, is why there's so much focus on this, particularly, but not only in the Congo.
Well, thanks for that, Prof. So we're going to come to questions which are already trooping in. But I want to ask again, of course, there is an absolute necessity for African countries to engage in export trading, to export their minerals, gold, cobalt, whatever. Some countries like Congo almost have their foreign income earning almost exclusively, apart from foreign aid, depending on mining products or mining dividends. But how do we then balance the need for trade with the need to prevent minerals causing chaos, causing political instability, causing the influx of weapons, causing the advance of adversaries, or not adversaries, but for bad-minded people like Wagner Group and whatnot? We need to export. We also need to protect ourselves from conflict. How do we do that? Do you think these countries have the political framework to achieve that? If not, how do we go about that? Suddenly we can't stop trading because it's causing chaos.
So when you say we, do you mean in the case of the Congo, for example, how would Congolese go about?
Congo, Angola, Nigeria, any African country, all these African countries whose foreign income heavily comes from export of mining resources.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I would say there is that there is definitely we should always be cautious about being too deterministic with these things, in the sense that there are other cases in other countries in Africa and elsewhere. Botswana might be a good example, where a high dependence upon mineral exports and revenue has not led to a similar outcome as we see in countries like the Congo or perhaps other places. So there are examples elsewhere on the continent where you can see ways in which governments have, not perfectly and not without problems, but nonetheless managed to manage their mineral exports in such a way that can contribute in a progressive and positive way to development in those countries through, for example, financing a welfare state or financing industrial policy to develop other industries. So personally, I think we should be wary of this idea of a resource curse, which I think can be overplayed and seems to be a little bit too deterministic for me. It gives this idea that if you have huge amounts of resources, you're just doomed and cursed for all of eternity. I don't think that's the case. And to answer your question, so what can be done and how can this be managed in such a way? Yeah, I think fundamentally within the current system that we have of nation states, the way that this can be done, the only way it can be done differently or in a more positive manner is through the state. What you hear in Congo all the time is, this il faut que l'État se réveille. The state needs to wake up. The state needs to wake up and do its job. And I think Congolese people have a very acute sense of the historic role and importance of the state in driving development through the management of mineral resources. And so I think it has to come back to that. That comes back to political leadership. It comes back to popular struggle. It comes back to class struggle. So there's that side of it. But I think at the same time, and I'll stop talking, I don't want to go on too long, but I think the other component is not to be dependent upon trickle-down what's often talked in economics as trickle-down theory, not to be too dependent upon the idea that you export these riches and the goods will trickle down to the rest of the population. I think however you manage your mining sector these days, particularly on the continent, where the mining sector is broadly controlled by foreign corporations, a lot of the value is very difficult to retain domestically and regionally on the continent. So a lot of the value from those minerals is going overseas, just through the nature of the ownership and management structures that are in place at the moment. So it makes it very difficult, I think, to create meaningful benefits from it. So I think at the same time, you also have to be thinking of ways to actively intervene and thinking through how to develop strategic sectors in the economy towards labor-intensive manufacturing, for example. It's going to create much more employment. You don't create much employment in the mining sector. Obviously, it's very capital intensive. So I think as well, what needs to happen is sort of a shift away from this idea that industrialization and development through mineral exports is the best way to approach this, because I think fundamentally that's only going to take you so far, and that you also need to be more actively thinking about developing other sectors and industries through state intervention and through industrial policy.
Right, certainly. I mean, there are cases or countries where even with, heavy state control, we still have, immense chaos. I mean, even the Congo itself, when the former Zaire under Mobutu was heavily controlled by the one-man show, and it was still a chaos. So I guess before I go to my follow-up question, I think it's time to actually take some of the questions we have in the chat box. So let's take this one from Zindi Anthony Levy. They say, what recommendations is there for African countries to benefit from mineral wealth when raw materials are not mostly transformed in the continent? In other words, how do we, either state control or private control, how do we benefit if we are not even processing these materials on our own land? Yeah. It's a classic.
Yeah. So I think two things come to mind there. The first is the answer is almost in the question. If these minerals are not being processed or value is not being added, it becomes very difficult, right? And we see that across the continent today, and that's why there's a lot of efforts. So, for example, Congo and Zambia today are trying to move into the electric vehicle battery industry, which I think is like an $8 trillion industry. And what they're trying to do is retain more value added than just exporting the cobalt. So it's very difficult if all you're doing is exporting like raw materials. The other thing I would say there, if I can bring this into the discussion, and this is something that comes out of my own research quite strongly and the research of others, is that there are two ways predominantly in which mining takes place. One is industrial mining, capital intensive, predominantly led by foreign corporations. The other way it takes place is labor intensive, often talked about as artisanal and small scale mining. And this has the advantage of employing a far higher number of people, and it has the advantage of retaining a much higher percentage of the value being generated by production in country. So that value is being retained and distributed amongst usually domestic actors in the country. So I would say, I think in many contexts on the continent of low-income economies with low industrial base, artisanal and small-scale mining is probably going to be more beneficial than capital-intensive industrial mining in that context, but has largely been marginalized over the last few decades within mining sector policy at the expense of industrial mining.
Okay, so we got to the next question from Gideon Ajay Mawuto. They say, what is the role of the green energy rush in the West, especially since most of these electric cars, for example, can hardly be afforded and used in most African countries? I guess that's a much more down the line question when we think about all this green revolution and how they could be adopted in African context, with the case of the electric car being one.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a very this is one of the big geopolitical tensions, I think, right now between Africa and the rest of the world, particularly the West, but also the East and China, is what is the role of Africa within the global transition to low carbon economies and societies? And I think the tension is that the West and the East, let's say, for want of a better classification, Europe, North America, East Asia, China, have very different ideas for the role of Africa within that transition to African governments, in the sense that my impression is what the West wants from Africa is what the West has always wanted from Africa, which is low price commodities as quickly as possible, please, so that we can use them to manufacture renewable energy products and export them to you, whether that be solar panels or wind turbines or electric vehicles. And the role for Africa there is quite clear. And I think it's quite similar in the East. Of course, what many African governments want is to try and leverage the green transition as an opportunity to transcend or overcome that historical legacy of being dependent upon commodity exports and move into value chains, right, through green technologies. And this is the battle that's taking place right now, I think. And this is what you're seeing. You see many African governments developing and designing industrial policy in this direction. The question is how far they're going to be able to take it. I think that's an open question right now. You have some, early movers, and you have countries like Rwanda, Nigeria, which is the context you will know far better than I, and others who are making efforts in this direction. But it's tough because you already have these markets already dominated by early entrants. And so it's never going to be easy. But so the role of the green transition as it's currently playing out, I would say Africa's role right now is providing those cheap raw materials as it's taking place today. And it might be that's how it continues.
I wonder, before I transition, if you see a similar transformation in terms of market price happening in the electric car line, as we've seen with things like solar panel, recycling processing. For example, what I'm trying to drive at is that when we first had the idea of solar panel in Africa, solar panel were immensely expensive, almost non-affordable. And the same thing as recycling of plastic and whatnot. And when African investors, African entrepreneurs, private individuals got involved, the price of solar panel today is so immensely cheap. I'm thinking, do you see the same transition happening in the electric car line down the line? And if so, what do you think needs to happen?
And if so,
what do you think needs to happen in terms of policies?
Yeah, so I think the decrease in the cost of solar is quite an exceptional story. You're right. Over the last decade, it's gone down 80%. I think the cost of solar photovoltaic has dropped 80%, predominantly because China just dominates the market with about 90% of global exports, and we moved into that space. You don't see the same movement happening as rapidly in the electric vehicle market. But what you do start to see, and again, I'll reference Rwanda because one of the countries I follow more closely. So in Rwanda, for example, I believe they signed a few years ago a deal with Volkswagen. I'm not sure if it's related to electric vehicles, but they're beginning, I think, a trajectory towards some domestic assembly and manufacture of vehicles. The market is much smaller, but it's rapidly growing, of course. We all know about kind of demographic trends on the continent. But I don't think the fall is happening so dramatically as has taken place in solar. But the other thing I would add on that is it's not just electric vehicles; it's also electric motorbikes.
Definitely. We use motorbikes than cars.
Yeah, and that's happening. You see that happening, right? That's happening in Rwanda. They're starting to move towards wanting to electrify or have electric-only motorbikes being used by moto taxis, for example, around the country. And so I see that probably being a more realistic kind of early entrant to the market.
Yeah, but these are still being, sorry to interrupt, but these are still being driven by, you said, Volkswagen, a private entity. So certainly they are still relatively played by some private sectors. I just wish more of them are African companies.
Yeah.
Do you disagree?
No, I completely agree. Yeah, you need domestic firms, you need the domestic capitalist class, you need Africans in this space, and that is what's lacking largely across much of the continent. It's the frustration. It's the same with renewable energy. You see lots of the renewable energy startups, and often they're named things like Power Africa or African Solar, but then you go onto the website and you look into, and it's often registered in Seattle in the US, or and it's not actually African owned and managed.
Yeah,
and that's a problem from the perspective of economic transformation and economic development. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, more question. Oluwatosi Adojitolego asks, there's a theory that conflicts and crises such as banditry, terrorism, and racketeering usually spring up in mineral-rich regions, especially when not properly managed. Is there some connection? What's your opinion on this? If true, what's the way out? I think you mentioned a little bit about this in the early iteration, but eventually, what's the relationship of conflicts and minerals? Any way out?
Yeah, so my answer to that question would be that I think the relationship is usually not so much that the presence of minerals is a driver of conflict, or this is certainly the case in the Congo, and I think it applies elsewhere. It's not often the root cause of why a conflict emerges. They're often much more politically anchored and embedded, and that could be at local level, national level, and at regional levels. But I think often the role that minerals then come to play is they become a means by which that conflict can be prolonged through its financing. So to me, I think that's more the relationship. And what's the second part of the question? Sorry, I've lost it.
How I think they ask,
what's the way out?
Yeah, what's the way out?
Yeah. That's the $1 million question for people who are working and studying and, for example, living in the Congo, trying to think what is the way out of this conflict that's been going on for more than 2 decades now. It's a very complicated answer. I don't think I'm well placed to offer a very cohesive one beyond saying that they are political in nature and they will need political solutions at multiple levels. And I don't think the way out is through regulating trade in conflict minerals, for example. I think that might be palliative, and it might have some impacts, but it won't. That is not the way out. I'll say that much.
Right. Well, so yeah, we get to the last part of the questions. Talking about Congo and way out and research there, you have a fascinating book coming up. Do you want to give us a hint of what are your major conclusions in that book as it relates to this topic in discuss?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's very briefly, and I've already touched on some of this. I suppose the book is basically talking about this idea of an African mining consensus, which I think is still the dominant way in which the mining sector is approached on the continent. And the idea broadly is that African countries, with mineral-rich African countries, the best way for them to industrialize is through their mineral sectors and through the revenues they can generate from mining. And the best way for this to take place is for it to be led by foreign corporations. And the productivity this generates can then drive structural transformation in other sectors of the economy. And this is the fundamental idea of the African mining consensus. And the book is basically using a case study of the Congo to try and problematize or challenge this consensus and suggest that this is actually, on the whole, not a very effective way to try and think about industrialization and economic transformation and job creation. Precisely because much of the value disappears overseas, industrial mining is very enclaved, it's largely disconnected and disembedded from the surrounding economies. And so I think alternative strategies are needed if we're thinking about industrialization and economic development on the continent beyond high GDP growth, which is mining is very good at delivering, but who benefits from that is a different question. I think I'll leave it at that, but thank you for the question.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ben Radley. It's so honoring to have you join us. And to everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for listening and for asking those amazing questions. Well, we will leave it at that, and we'll see you next month at the next edition of the African Webinar. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.